Okay, Jacob lives his final 17 years of life in Egypt. Before his passing, he asks Joseph to take an oath that he will bury him in the Holy Land. He blesses Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, elevating them to the status of his own sons as progenitors of tribes within the nation of Israel. So we can talk about that for a moment, and that is that Jacob says, let's read the nutshell. We'll go back later. The patriarch desires to reveal the end of days to his children, but is prevented from doing so. Jacob blesses his sons, assigning to each his role as a tribe. Judah will produce leaders, legislatures, and kings. Priests will come from Levi, scholars from Yisachar, seafarers from Zebulun, school teachers from Simon, soldiers from Gad, judges from Dan, olive growers from Asher, and so on. Reuben is rebuked for confusing his father's marriage bed. Simon and Levi for the massacre of Shechem and the plot against Joseph. Naphtali is granted the swiftness of a deer, Benjamin the ferociousness of a wolf, and Joseph is blessed with beauty and fertility. A large funeral procession consisting of Jacob's descendants, Pharaoh's ministers, the leading citizens of Egypt, and the Egyptian cavalry accompanies Jacob on his final journey to the Holy Land, where he is buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron. Joseph too dies in Egypt at the age of 110. He too instructs that his bones be taken out of Egypt and buried in the Holy Land, but this would come to pass only with the Israelites' exodus from Egypt many years later. Before his passing, Joseph conveys to the children of Israel the testament from which they will draw their hope and faith in the difficult years to come. God will surely remember you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short, the Parsha in a nutshell. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about, but if we're still talking about the general idea of the Parsha, so let's talk about the burial. Maybe we should think about the burial of Jacob and the burial of Joseph. So we'll open up the screen and we'll see what Jacob asks for and what Joseph asks for and how it differs. So in the beginning of the Parsha, this is the beginning, Genesis chapter 47, verse 28. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years, and Jacob's days, the years of his life, were 147 years. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called his son Joseph, and he said to him, "If I have now found favor in your eyes, now place your hand beneath my thigh, and you shall deal with me with loving kindness and truth. Do not bury me now in Egypt. I will lie with my forefathers, and you shall carry me out of Egypt, and you shall bury me in their grave." And he said, "I will do as you say." And he said, "Swear to me." So he swore to him, and Israel prostrated himself on the head of the bed. So this is indeed what happens. And the end of the Parsha, there's a great description, a great length, as the nutshell alluded to the actual procession and to the funeral. And the Torah keeps saying that he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, where that Abraham purchased for Sarah, and where Isaac and Rebekah were buried, and where Leah was buried. And so that's the story with Jacob. He requests, and the children promise, and they fulfill the promise that they carry him out of Egypt. When it comes to Joseph, so that's the end of the Parsha. So this is the first reading. If we jump to the seventh reading, and we go to the end of the Parsha, so when you come to Joseph, it's a little bit different, as the nutshell alluded to. So verse 24, 25, and 26, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am going to die. God will surely remember you and take you out of the land, out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph adjured the children of Israel, made them swear, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here. And the final verse of the entire book of Genesis, and Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and they embalmed him, and he was placed into the coffin in Egypt. So it's very different. Whereas Jacob is taken out of Egypt, Joseph remains in Egypt. And only a few portions later, when it comes to the Exodus, the Torah says that Moses takes the bones of Joseph and takes them out of Egypt with him, because that was the promise that the children of Israel swore to Joseph. So what is the symbolism of this? So there's two ideas of how to look at this. So in other words, what is better for the Jewish people, to have the righteous people buried in Egypt, or for them to be taken to the land of Israel? So one way to think about this is if Jacob was buried in Egypt, if Jacob is buried in the land of Egypt, that is a little bit of a problem, because that means that we're settling in the land of Egypt, and the people living in Egypt becomes their land. Whereas Jacob wants to remind them that, to the contrary, Jacob wants to remind them that this is not their native place. Their native place is the land of Israel. So when Jacob says, do not bury me here and take me to the land of Egypt, take me back to the land of Egypt, land of Israel, and bury me in Israel, the result is the Jewish people coming back to Egypt after the funeral know that this is not their native place. Their native place is the land of Israel. And if their children ask, where's grandpa buried? It's the land of Israel. Why the land of Israel? Because we're all Hebrews. We come from the land of Israel. You wouldn't have that if Jacob himself was buried in the land of Egypt. On the other hand, you also want a scenario where there are righteous people buried in Egypt. Because when Joseph is buried in Egypt, so that reminds the people of the story of Joseph. And the story of Joseph is, of course, a great inspiration to the Jewish people, because the story of Joseph is that even though he was, of course, sold as a slave, and ultimately he triumphed and he became the leader of the land of Egypt, and he was able to overcome all the challenges. So the burial place of Joseph serves as a great encouragement for the Jewish people for the next almost 200 years that they were going to be in Egypt. So in some sense, it's like having one foot out of Israel, but another foot in Egypt. And that's sort of Jacob being buried in the land of Israel. Joseph saying, eventually take me to Israel, but in the meantime, I'm going to be here in the land of Egypt. And the Rebbe once spoke that the last verse of the entire book of Exodus says what? And if you see that there's two verses here, verse 25 is pretty optimistic, pretty upbeat, sort of forward-looking and hopeful. Joseph adjured the children of Israel, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here. Okay, that's a beautiful way to end the Torah. God will surely remember you. What a beautiful way to end. Instead, what's the end of the book of Genesis? He was placed into a coffin in Egypt. Joseph is stuck in Egypt. Now, the premise is that if you're going to end, you want to end on a high note, even though it's not the end of the entire story, but you want to end with something positive. So why wouldn't you, the Rebbe suggested, just switch verse 26 and 25? What's the problem? Say Joseph died. Before he died, he made the Jewish people promise, and he said, God will take me out of here when God takes you out of Egypt. And you conclude the book with the notion that God will take you out of Egypt. Beautiful. But the Rebbe says, no, verse 26, in fact, is a greater encouragement. The fact that Joseph was placed into a coffin in Egypt together with the people, that is an encouragement for the people, that they have the message and they have the proximity to Joseph to gain inspiration from. Happens to be, when the Rebbe spoke about this, the Rebbe also explained that that's why many of the leaders of the Jewish people were buried outside of Israel, beginning with Moses himself. Moses himself wasn't buried in Israel. The Medrash says because Moses' generation didn't enter Israel, so Moses himself also remains with his generation outside of Israel, symbolically. And when the Rebbe spoke about this, the Rebbe spoke about the ohel, the burial spot of his father-in-law, who was also named Joseph. And he explained that when the leader is with us and buried in the exile, in some sense, that gives us a great encouragement and great empowerment to be able to remain connected to God. So that's just to mention to talk about the beginning and the end of the parsha, because you see the contrast of the two burials. Jacob says, take me out. Joseph says, take me out later. But in the meantime, I'm here. I'm with the people. And in some sense, that's our attitude toward life in general. And in some sense, we're planted in the physical, we're planted in the Egypt, we're planted in the material realm, but we also understand that our source and where we come from and our purpose remains lofty and symbolic land of Israel, spirituality. So that's just a little bit of touching upon the beginning of the parsha and the end of the parsha. And now we can think about getting into the specifics. Okay, so one thing we can do is we can begin thinking about the blessings of Jacob, because I don't think we have done this, I don't think we analyzed it specifically in the last years and in the past years. So if you go, the beginning of the parsha, there's a lot of drama between Jacob and Joseph when Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. We talked about that in the past. So maybe we'll skip over that for now, and maybe we'll go back to it later if we have extra time. But when you get to the fourth reading, it's Jacob calling his sons, and he says, very interesting what he says, because he doesn't really say, come and I will bless you. So let's see what he says. Jacob called for his sons and said, gather, and I will tell you what will happen to you at the end of days. Okay, so you're expecting to hear what will happen at the end of days. But then he says something else. Gather and listen, sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. Now, what is verse 2? Verse 1, he says, gather and I will tell you that what will happen to you at the end of days. And verse 2 says, gather and listen, Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. What is 2 adding? So there's 2 ways to look at it. You could look at it as Jacob in the blessings becomes very poetic. And when you become poetic, you repeat things to make it more beautiful for the style. So verse 2, he's not contradicting verse 1. He's just adding more terms. He's just saying, come and speak and gather and listen to Jacob, listen to Israel, your father. In other words, he's not really contradicting verse 1. And then did Jacob, in fact, tell his sons what will happen at the end of days? According to this reading, yes, because certain things that he's going to talk about is future tense. He talks about what's going to happen in the future. So that's the end of days. That's one way of reading it. But the Medrash reads it very differently. The Medrash reads it that and that's what the parsha in a nutshell alluded to. At the first verse, when he says, gather and I will tell you what will happen to you at the end of days, Jacob wanted to tell them what is the end of days, when the end of days will come. What does the end of days mean? The end of days doesn't mean when the world will be destroyed, but it means when the Messianic era comes. In other words, when all the challenge and the difficulty is done and we come back to Israel in peace and tranquility and the negativity is eradicated. That's the end of days. Now, if that is what Jacob actually intended to say, when the end of days will come, and what will happen in the end of days. End of days is a very common, not very, but it's a common phrase in the books of the prophets, referring to the ultimate redemption. If that's what he intended to say, he never said it. Because what he does is he ends up blessing most of his children, cursing a few of them, but he doesn't really tell them, he doesn't tell them at all what will be at the end of days. And that's why Rashi comes in, and Rashi says, quotes the Medrash, and he says, Jacob wanted to tell them what happened at the end of the days, but he couldn't, because it was concealed from him. In other words, God didn't want him to give that information over. So then he reorients. And in verse 2, he says, come, listen, let me talk to you. And he starts talking to them about other matters, about matters of blessing. So that's the Medrash, Midrashic interpretation, which Rashi explains, but you see why Rashi says it, because the problem is that he says, I'm going to tell you what happens in the end of days, but he never does. So I will tell you, says Rashi, he attempted to reveal the end, but the Shekhinah withdrew from him. So he began to say other things. This comes from the Talmud and from the Medrash. And then he says, okay, gather, and he starts blessing them. Most of them he blesses. So there's a lot to talk about. Why did he want them to know the end of days? Why did God not want him to know, to tell the children, his children, when is the end of days? So that's a whole discussion. We can talk about this for a very long time. I'm just going to try to be very brief and say one or two points. So one point is the big question on this is, what would Jacob gain by telling his children that the date of when the Mashiach comes? In retrospect, we know that it's thousands of years away, right? So it's at least 3,300 years away, more, 3,500 years away. So if you're living in Egypt and your father calls you and he says, look, I'm going to tell you good news. I'm going to tell you when the end of days will come, when all the calamities will end, when the world will reach perfection. Say, really? Very interesting to know. When is it? Is it next week? Is it next weekend? He says, no, it's 3,500 years away. Again, at a minimum, because Mashiach didn't come yet. So I would think, perhaps, that would be discouraging. And maybe that's why God did not tell Jacob when the end of, did not allow, it was concealed. The information was concealed from him, and he wasn't able to tell it to his sons. So maybe that's why, maybe because the information itself would be discouraging instead of encouraging. The problem with that interpretation is that you don't understand, why did Jacob want to say it to begin with? So there are various interpretations. I'll give you the Rebbe's interpretation. The Rebbe's interpretation is that the end of days was supposed to be not thousands of years away, but maybe a few hundred years away. Why is that? That's based on the Medrash. The Medrash says that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they were supposed to go to the land of Israel, and that was supposed to be the end of days. Then the world would reach perfection, Mashiach would have been here. It's alluded to in the song of the crossing of the sea, where then the Jewish people, this is before the sin, so they leave Egypt, they cross the sea, they sing a song to God. And at the end of the song to God, what do they say? They say, you're going to cross them, you're going to bring them in to the land of your inheritance, meaning the land of Israel. They're going to build the temple. You're going to build the temple will be built. And then Hashem Yimlech L'Olam Vad, God will reign forever. Done. End of history. In other words, end of the tumultuous history. Then we reach tranquility. Everything is fine. That was what was supposed to happen. The reality is that we sinned. We had the golden calf, and then we had the spies, and therefore it starts getting delayed. And once it gets delayed, it gets delayed. So when Jacob was going to tell the Jewish people, his sons, when Mashiach will come, it's going to be a question of a few years. Mashiach, the end of days is going to be, it wasn't supposed to be in a few thousand years, it was really a few hundred years, 200-300 years, 200 years. So that's makes it easier. So it's actually just hang on a little bit more. It's just 200 years, we'll be done with this. But again, the problem with that interpretation is that none of them are, no one's going to live that long. So what's the point? So here the Rebbe says something interesting. He says that the secret that he was going to tell them is that there's an end date to the exile, but you can actually make that date closer. And that's in fact what happened, because the Jewish people, there's a big problem that God tells Abraham that your descendants will be slaves for 400 years. Reality, they were only in Egypt for 210 years. Of those 210 years of slavery was probably only for 86 years. So the question is, what happened to the 400 years? So there are multiple answers, but one answer is God brought it early. We didn't have the full 400 because the Jewish people, for whatever reason, they merited, and it was brought early. So based on that logic, what Jacob really wanted to tell his sons is the end of days is just a few hundred years away, but you can actually make it come closer. And the point of that would be to give them encouragement to remain loyal to Hashem, etc. So that's beautiful. Now we understand why why Jacob would want them to know the end of days. But once we solve that problem, now we have another problem. So why does God not want them to know? Why does God conceal it from them? And here the Rebbe says, the reason for that is because the purpose of exile is to transform the darkness. That we're in a situation where it's dark, we don't sense the light at the end of the tunnel, and nevertheless, we remain close to Hashem, we remain loyal to God. So once you know the end date, it's not really an exile. Once you see through the facade and you realize that there's an end, and the end is actually in your hands to make it come closer. So in a sense, it's not an exile. And it defeats the purpose of the exile. Purpose of the exile is to have faith even in the midst of the intense darkness. And to have that, the Kates, the end of days, this secret, that the end of days is not that far, and we can actually make it come closer. If you see the light at the end of the tunnel, then you're not in the darkness, and what you're doing is not transforming the darkness. And that's why God conceals the end of days from Jacob, and Jacob wants to say it. He can't say it, and therefore he shifts and he starts talking about blessings. And we have to figure out, this is all introduction to figure out what are the blessings. It's not so clear what he's trying to do to these children. What is he saying? Why is he saying? But that's already verse 2 and 3. We started with verse 1. He tried to say the Kates, he tried to say the end of days. He was not successful because the purpose is to be in the dark. Why? Not because we like darkness, because the concept of exile is about the transformation of darkness, to be in a situation of darkness and yet have faith. And what that does to us, that is what transforms the darkness, according to the Hasidic interpretation. So that's by way of introduction to the actual blessings. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question about what Jacob said first. He didn't intend to say when the end of days was, right? He said, I'm going to tell you what happened, right? So his intent wasn't telling exactly. So he probably knew that it's even without any intervention, that it's not that useful to know when the end of day is, because you otherwise it's limited. It's limiting.
Yeah, you're right. The Medrash says, the verse says, I will tell you what will occur at the end of days. But the Medrash, like I said, the rest of the verse says, the Medrash says, I will tell you, he wanted to say the Kates, the end of days, when it is. The Medrash implies that he wanted to know when it is. So you could say it's a contradiction, but that doesn't have to be a contradiction. Because if you tell me when, I also know, if you tell me what, I also know when. Right? If you tell me at the end of days, Joe Biden is going to be the president. Okay, so I know it's going to be 2023. You see what I'm saying? So it could be that it's not really a contradiction, because if I know what, I also know when.
Did he also explain to them what the end of days was?
He didn't end up talking about the end of days. But he said, I have a declaration. I'm going to tell you what happens in the end of days. Now the question is, does he actually do that? Well, it depends. Like I said, I started out, there's two ways of reading it. One way to read it, yeah, he told them what's going to happen at the end of days. The Judah is going to be the scholar, is going to be the king, and etc. Every tribe is going to have their own thing. But is that the end of days? That's not what the prophets refer to as the end of days. The end of days refers to as the time that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God, and there's no more pain, no more suffering. So by that definition of the end of days, he certainly did not tell them what's going to happen at the end of days. We didn't say anything about the end of days. So what happened? So that's what the Medrash comes in and fills in the blanks and says he wanted to talk about the end of days, but the divine presence departed from him. So he sensed that he's not supposed to do it. And the question is why? And again, we have to explain both sides. Why did Jacob want to, and why did God say, and why did God not want him to? So that's what we just did. I mean, in the actual essay of the Rebbe takes it apart even more, and it gives more details and sort of a more analysis. But we don't have time to do that on Thursday. Today, in this forum, but maybe we'll do it in another year. But yeah, so that's the story in short.
I think I read that the Rebbe said that based on a verse that says that whatever you desire in your heart God will grant that. So it was that we know in our souls what the answer is, but we don't know consciously, and that so that we lift all the sparks that we need to, bring all the light that we need to, that had to happen anyway in Galut.
Yeah, so that's part of that essay and that analysis. It's sort of the dance. It's sort of having Jacob's perspective, understanding Jacob's perspective, and understanding God's perspective. And then at the end, we say ultimately we have a little bit of both. But so I can't comment exactly, because again, there's different things going on over there. But the idea here is that Jacob wants to reveal and he cannot. In other words, it has to be darkness. Jacob says, could we have an exile without darkness? Wouldn't that be wonderful? In other words, could you have an exile that you know is a difficulty, but you know when it's going to end? If you know it's going to end, it's not difficult. In other words, it's not ultimate darkness. Ultimate darkness is when you see that you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Now the question is that good or bad? Well, it depends what the purpose is. The purpose is that they give us easy lives, then it would be very nice. And it would be very nice to know when the end of days is. It's very nice not to be in the darkness. But if the purpose is to transform darkness, and that's the Hasidic and Kabbalistic idea of exile, but also all difficulty, any difficulty, the purpose is the transformation. And we're in this world to transform the most difficult circumstances, because we are in spiritual darkness, and unfortunately also, and sometimes we also in physical darkness. But the point is to transform. What does transform mean? To show that it's not really dark, because we could be in the midst of the darkness and yet have faith. So what does that show? That means the concealment is not really a concealment.
Right.
What that does, ultimately, that transforms the concealment. So that's the purpose. If that's the purpose, then you can't know the end of days. So we have to be in the dark.
Right. Thank you.
When I was younger, I had this thing. I don't know if it was just me. I had this thing. I wanted to see where am I going to be in 10 years from now? I just had this like, where am I going to be? What is it going to look like? And in some sense, if you knew the answer, then what's the point, right? Part of the idea is that you don't know. And that's the mystery. And that's the mystery of life. And you move forward and you figure it out. But if I could tell you where I'm going to be when I'm 80, that takes away from the living life. In this context, it takes away from the I want to say living life is darkness, but once you know the goal, then the game, if you know the end of the movie, then the movie is not interesting, right? And there's no suspense, so the movie's not interesting. If the purpose of the movie is to be, I don't want to say life is a horror film, but if the purpose of the movie is to overcome the darkness, then you can't know the end, and you certainly can't know when the end is going to happen.
Thank you.
Okay, so now he shifts and he starts talking. What does he talk? The assumption is that he's going to speak blessings. Why? Even though he doesn't mention the word blessing in the beginning. But at the end of the speaking to the 12 sons, then he says he blessed. So let's look what happens. Let's look at the verse. So let's look at the verse. So he says, gather and listen, sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. And then he says, Reuven starts giving a speech. That's giving a speech for Reuven, Shimon, and the first three he doesn't bless. He actually curses their wrath in verse 7. Verse 8, he starts giving blessings, but he doesn't say the word blessing. But at the end of all 12 sons, of course, Jacob gets the longest one, Joseph gets the longest one. At the end of all 12 sons, he says as follows, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father spoke to them and blessed them. Each man, according to his blessing, he blessed them. Okay, so we assume and we know that we're going to refer to this as the blessings of Jacob. Jacob blesses all of his sons. That's what it says. Each one, according to his blessing, he blessed them. So this leads to a few questions that we have to analyze even before we get to the actual blessings. Number one, he didn't bless all of them. He blessed the first three he cursed. He didn't bless the first one, and the second and third, he cursed their wrath. So they don't get any blessing. So what are you telling me? He blessed each one. That's one problem. And the more general problem is, what is a blessing? What is a blessing? Could he have given the blessing of Judah to Joseph? In other words, what is a blessing? A blessing, if you wouldn't bless me, would I not receive that which the blessing says? In other words, what is the function of a blessing in general? So one way to think about this, there are multiple ways of thinking about this, but one way of thinking about this is the blessing. In Kabbalah, there's a very big difference between a blessing and a prayer. And even the wording of a blessing and a prayer are very different. A blessing is said in the form of a fact. It's going to happen. The priestly blessing, for example, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha. God will bless you and guard you, etc., etc. Now, in English, they translate God should, but in Hebrew, should and will is the same word. So it could be read, God will bless you and guard you, etc. All these blessings are stated as facts. This is what's going to happen. Whereas when you talk about prayer, so the quintessential prayer is Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will that this and this should happen. When you talk about prayer, you're not saying a fact. You're not saying this is going to happen. You're making a request. So what's the difference? So the Kabbalah says like this. The idea of blessing, when I bless you, what I'm really saying is, I'm trying to help your potential, the good that's within you, to come to fruition. So that is not, it's not a question of, I hope God will allow this to happen. You have that potential already. So it's going to happen. May happen now, may happen tomorrow, may happen in this incarnation, it might happen in the next incarnation, but that potential already exists. The blessing is to figure out, help the process of bringing the potential to the actual. That's what a blessing is. A prayer is very different. I hope God will help me do something that I don't have yet. Well, maybe he will, maybe he won't. In fact, I ask God, Yehi Ratzon, please have a new will, right? Let's say, God forbid, I'm suffering and I'm sick. What do I tell God? I say, God, please, if I'm sick, it's because you wanted me to be sick. Please have a new will and change your will. And that's the idea of prayer, which is a fascinating concept, that we ask God to change his will. Or God asks us to ask him to change his will. But when I say change your will, I mean that there is no guarantee, A, and B, I don't have it yet. I have to ask for something. Whereas what is a blessing? A blessing is the opposite. A blessing is, I have it. I have to bring it into fruition. I have to reveal it. And if you think about the blessings in that sense, when Jacob tells his children what will be in the future, and he says, you'll be this, you'll be that, he's not just sort of dividing, he has a bag of goodies and he's dividing each one, giving each one a treat. He's doing the greatest blessing to which a father can give to a parent, can give to a child, which is help the child understand their own skill and their own potential and their own gifts. And what he's trying to say is, don't try to be your brother. Don't try to say, well, my brother's good at that, and I think I'm going to try to do that as well. What he's trying to help them is identify this blessing that he sees within them, and he believes this is their potential. And now it's their job to make that happen. But the blessing, therefore, it's not that he could have switched a blessing from one to another, because his blessing is identify that potential, the skill and the gift that the child already has. Now we have to deal with the first three children. The first three children he does not bless. And like I said, child's second and third children, he actually curses their wrath. So the general point, the simple way of reading it is he wanted to bless them, but he was so upset at them because of their sins, so he curses them. That's the simple interpretation. But we can't say that. Number one, because at the end it says he blessed all of them. So if he blessed all of them, how were the first ones, how is that considered a blessing if it appears like a curse? So some of the commentators, certainly the more Kabbalistic and Hasidic commentators, say as follows. If you read it carefully, the curse is not really a curse. The curse is helping the child redirect the negative tendency that is being cursed. It's very clear. He says, that their wrath be cursed. He's not cursing them, and Rashi makes that point. It's not some new age stuff. Rashi says, even when he cursed them, he didn't curse them, he cursed their wrath. So they have negativity within them, which is a big problem. And what Jacob is going to do is going to teach them, hopefully, how to channel that into a positive and make it into a blessing. So that's consistent with the goal here. The goal here is to help the child identify their inner essence, their inner gift, and help them bring that to fruition. And in that sense, all of them were blessings, even the first three where you don't necessarily sense the blessing. So that's one interpretation of this whole story. And we're going to get back to we're going to get back to this. We're going to try to read some of them specifically. That's one interpretation. I'm going to add one thing here. And this is the culmination of the book of Exodus, the book of Genesis, I'm sorry. Because in the last few generations, actually going all the way back to Adam in some sense, it was always about selecting the child who is most suited to bear the legacy of monotheism. Even in Abraham's children, Adam's children. So Cain kills Havel, and then you end up with Shet. Seth is the third one. And Seth is the one who carries the voice of morality, not Cain's descendants. And Noach is a descendant of Shet. And then Noach has three sons. Ultimately, the voice of monotheism comes through the older one, Shem, not Ham and Yafet, etc. happens. That ultimately one is accepted and one is rejected from the responsibility to bear the legacy to carry the voice of monotheism, the voice of moral ethics. In the end of the book, which is the culmination, here's a new idea. Here, the idea here is that once we get to the certain point where we need multiple children to do this, in other words, there's not one way to do this. There's not one way to bring morality into the world. And therefore, every person has to look at their own individual gifts. And they have to look at themselves and say, okay, I'm not my brother, maybe I'm not the leader, but I have something that is indispensable to the Jewish story. And that's something new because it didn't happen in the previous generations. And ultimately, that's the culmination of the book because that's the takeaway. The takeaway is we're all part of one story and each person has their own gift with which they contribute to the purpose of transforming the world. And that's why each one has their individual gift because you can only do, you're supposed to do, is express your gift and your blessing and your personality. So that's one way of reading this entire story, which we'll do a little bit of that. Another way of reading this entire story is, it's really a question of, more of a practical way, it's really a question of selecting who is going to be the leader. And therefore he says, 1, 2, 3, you're out. In other words, the first three, he does not bless them. They're not going to be the leader. Judah becomes the leader. He has a very long blessing. And then he starts talking about the other children because in some sense, the other children are also leaders in certain different ways. And that's another way of looking at the purpose of these blessings, not so much to find the gift of every individual, but it's really a selection of leadership. And so there's basically two general stories of how to read this, but they all come to the end. They come to the same place that after the blessings, he blesses all of them. And if you only read the book of this parsha, it doesn't seem so radical. And if you think about your own family, well, hopefully your father's going to bless all your mother is going to bless all the children, it doesn't seem so radical. But because this is the final portion in the entire book of Genesis, comparing it to the book of Genesis, this is actually radical. That there are at least 12 ways to serve God. There are 12 ways to shine, 12 ways to transform the world. If there are 12, then there are 600,000 and there's millions and billions, right? The point is that everybody has to find their gift and their way of expressing this truth. And that's what Jacob contributes to the conversation. So that is by way of introduction. Now that we made all the introductions, we have 14 minutes left and we can read a few of the verses. Reuven, you are my firstborn, my strength, and the first of my might. We'll skip the brackets. Superior in rank and superior in power. Unbelievable. Seems like a blessing is coming, right? You're my firstborn, my strength, might, superior in rank, superior in power. Unbelievable. However, however, verse 4. The restlessness of water, you shall not have superiority. For you ascended upon your father's couch, then you profaned him who ascended upon my bed. What is he talking about? So there is a verse that says that after Rachel died, Reuven went and lied with Bilhah, his father's maidservant, or his mother's maidservant. Terrible sin. The commentaries explain, at least the sages explain, not just the commentaries, the Medrash, the sages of the Medrash explain, the traditional view is he didn't lie with her. It's not what he did. What he did was he moved his father's bed from the tent of Bilhah to the tent of his mother Leah. So just to remember the story, there are two sisters. Jacob marries two sisters. He was tricked into marrying Leah, and then he marries Rachel. Each one had a maidservant. They wanted to have more children. So in addition to their own children, each one of them gave their maidservant to their husband. And here you have Jacob has 2 wives, 2 maidservants, and 12 sons. Now, Jacob's primary residence was in the tent of Rachel because he loved her the most, and she was actually the wife he chose. He only married Leah because he was tricked into marrying Leah. So what happens is, after Rachel dies, Jacob puts his bed, establishes his primary residence in the tent of Bilhah, who's Rachel's maidservant. And Reuven is very offended for his mother, because he says, okay, my mother is Rachel's sister. Okay, so her sister can go first, but not her sister's maidservant. So he moves his bed. Rashi seems that Jacob is very offended by this. He thinks that this is disrespect, and it's disrespect for God who's on my bed. He's very upset. And therefore he says, you're not going to have the advantage. You're not going to have superiority. You're not going to be the Bechor. You're not going to be the first one. Doesn't seem like such a terrible sin to make somebody lose the position of leadership. If you ask me, it doesn't seem so terrible, right? Maybe you disagree, but to me, it doesn't seem so terrible. Yeah, it doesn't seem so terrible. So why is this so bad? So there are different interpretations. I'll give you one interpretation. One interpretation is that the key here is restlessness of water. Pachaz meaning to rush. You rush like water. And the problem is that Jacob, that Reuven, when he saw what happened, he immediately acted to defend his mother. Now the question is acting immediately, is it a good trait or a bad trait? So it seems that what Jacob is saying, since Jacob puts the emphasis not so much on the sin, but on the restlessness of water, meaning you're rushing. You're not thinking about this, you're not analyzing. So it seems that it's not a terrible sin, but it's not the quality of leadership. A leader cannot be impulsive. And that's why he says the problem is not so much the sin, the problem is the impulsiveness of rushing like water. And that's why you're a great guy, but you cannot be the leader. So that's one way to think about this. But the other side, and that's what we're going to try to see both sides of this in all 3 children who were not blessed. The other side is identifying also his greatest quality. His greatest quality is that when he sees something, when he sees an opportunity, he runs like water. In other words, impulsiveness could be bad, but it could be good. You can use that trait to grasp opportunity. And therefore, if you think about the history of Reuven, you see that many times he was the first to make the right choice. Like when the sale of Joseph, he wasn't able to get his brothers not to sell Joseph, but he said, not to kill Joseph, but he said, don't kill him, put him in the pit. He was the first one to try to repent. And you see it in other instances in his life. So what Jacob is trying to say, I would love to give you the keys of leadership. I would love for you to be the king, but you have the quality of being impulsive like water. Is that a positive or a negative? The answer, it's positive. You need someone to jump first. You need someone to not just be calm in the face of a negative action. You have to stand up for what you believe is true. You cannot wait to analyze. If you overanalyze, you're not going to achieve anything. But what he's saying is leadership, you can't do the leadership. So in that sense, he's also, if you want to look at it in the positive, he's also blessing him. He's telling him your quality is that you are impulsive like water. You rush like water. Rushing like water is a wonderful trait. in certain contexts, if you know how to use it, if you know how to channel it. But he's showing that, and that's the greatest gift he's giving his child, showing him what he thinks his quality is. Now we're going to go to a few of the other, the next two. The next two is Shimon and Levi brothers, our brothers. Stolen instruments are their weapons. He is very upset at these two brothers. What do you remember about these two brothers? These two brothers were the brothers that killed the entire city of Shechem after their sister Dinah was raped. And I think we discussed it, we may have discussed it this year, if not in the past years, that there's a conversation between Jacob and his sons after the act. And Jacob thinks, after the act of killing the entire city, and Jacob thinks it was a bad idea. The sons think it's a good, they think what they did was right. And the Torah actually gives the last words to the brothers in the conversation. He says, what? Or will our sister be like a harlot? And that's it, that's in the conversation. So there's no closure. The problem here where there's a conversation, no one knows who's right. So what happens in this verse? In this verse, Jacob says, Shimon and Levi have stolen instruments. Are their weapons? What does it mean, stolen instruments? Here's a beautiful, beautiful Rashi. Rashi says that Jacob says, my father blessed Esav, and he said, Al char b'chatichya, you will live by your sword. You will live by your sword. He says, you stole the craft of Esav. The store of the violence is not part of our family tradition. You stole it. And therefore he requests, let my soul not enter their council. My honor, you shall not join their assembly. For in their wrath they killed a man, meaning they killed all the people of Shechem. Rashi says in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, many men could be called man. And with their will, they hamstrung a bull. It's not the Rashi here. Every single word in this verse is analyzed. Some say he also is referring to Joseph. Joseph is a bull later on in the blessings. So basically, these guys, first of all, they killed the entire city of Shechem. Number two, what he does is he at least is alluding to the fact that they were instrumental in the sale of Joseph, because they were the older ones. We know that Reuven wasn't there, wasn't present at the sale. That's what the verse says explicitly. So the next two older sons are Shimon and Levi. So they had to be instrumental in hamstring the bull. In other words, to uprooting the bull, meaning Joseph. So basically, he says, these guys are thieves. They stole the violence. I want nothing to do with them. Cursed be their wrath, for it is mighty, and their anger because it is harsh. I will separate them throughout. I will separate them throughout Jacob. Divide them throughout Jacob, and I will scatter them throughout Israel. Looks like very, very harsh, especially verse 7. But with the help of the commentators, you realize that there's positivity here. The first strange thing is that here Shimon and Levi curses their wrath. He comes down really hard on Shimon and Levi. The problem is that Levi, at least Levi, actually becomes the most chosen and holy tribe. Levi becomes the tribe that serves in the temple. Moses and Aaron come from Levi. So what does it mean? He says he's cursing them, and he can't find any word of blessing for Levi at all, Shimon and Levi. And in fact, it's not that Jacob didn't know that ultimately Levi is going to be chosen, because the commentaries explain that when he says, I will separate them throughout Jacob, he's referring to Levi because the Levites did not get a portion in the land of Israel. So how do they sustain themselves? They sustain themselves by receiving the tithes, scattering throughout the entire land of Israel, and receiving the tithings from the fields of the Israelites. So in other words, Rashi, if according to Rashi, Jacob is referring to the fact that Levi is going to be scattered because he's not getting a portion of the land of Israel, because they are chosen to serve in the temple. So how could it be that in the same context he's telling them that on one hand you're going to be cursed, your wrath is cursed. On the other hand, he talks about how they're going to be chosen, and we know they're going to be chosen. So if this is just a curse, why are they going to be chosen? So there are different ways of explaining this, but some people, the point here is they have this quality of standing up for what they believe is true, even with harshness, which is even killing the entire city of Sodom, of Shechem. Jacob is saying that quality, you have to figure out how to deal with that quality within yourself. And if you figure out how to deal with that quality, you will be able to become the priest. You'll be able to become the chosen tribe. And what exactly he's telling them, it's not 100% clear. One way to think about this, Achalkim b'Yaakov, spread it throughout the land of Israel. In other words, if it's concentrated in one place, if you have too much of a drive for justice and a drive for perfection in one place, then that could lead to violence. Because if you're not, because if there's too much of this quality, it could be too harsh. But if you spread it out throughout Israel, then it's acceptable. Another way of saying that, if you take that harshness and that dedication and you channel it toward serving the people, then that same quality becomes positive. In other words, someone that's standing up for the truth, someone that's willing to risk their life, to kill the entire city, to protect their sister, is someone who has a tremendous amount of dedication to what they believe is true. Now, that could be dangerous in concentration, right? If you don't consider other people, that could be a very dangerous quality. It could lead to violence. And he curses their wrath, and he curses the way they expressed that commitment and that strength. But the end of verse 7, he's saying, what is the healing? How he spread them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. And Rashi also says that Simon, Levi, was scattered throughout Israel because they were the Levites. Rashi says Shimon was Melamdei Tinokos, they were teachers. And because they were teachers, specifically teachers for children, so therefore they would in those days the kids that weren't sent off to school, to boarding school, but the teachers went especially in rural areas. Israel was primarily rural in that time, so that the people would actually go to the teachers would go to the students. So they're spreading out throughout the entire land of Israel. So the point here is he's showing them how to use the quality of their soul, that strength, that commitment to do what's right. But if you dedicate it to public service, that's how you sweeten that harshness that they had and expressed itself in a negative way. So that's the first three, hardest to deal with. After that is all blessing. After that is all blessing. And we could think about the specific ones, but because we hit 11 o'clock, 11:01, I was very bad at pacing myself this morning. So I apologize for that. We'll go to the last verse. We'll read the last verse. We'll say chazak, chazak, and then have about 5 minutes for questions and comments if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we should see each other in good health. So here we go. Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and they embalmed him and was placed into the coffin in Egypt. Chazak, chazak, chazek, be strong, and they would be strengthened. And of course, the ultimate message of this parsha is that everybody should find their own specific gift, quality that is unique to them, and nobody has what you have, because you are indispensable. And finding that blessing and figuring out how to use it in the service of Hashem is really the overarching theme of this parsha. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, be well, everybody. Take care. Thank you.